Helen stood in the center of her marble kitchen. A steaming pot of low-country shrimp and grits on the stove, the smell of garlic and bay leaf drifting into the formal dining room. She wiped her hands on a linen towel, her eyes darting to the antique clock on the wall. 8:17 p.m. Edward was late again. She adjusted the table setting for the third time. The candles now burned halfway down, their light flickering against the polished mahogany. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Linen napkins folded with military precision, crystal glasses aligned like soldiers in a parade. The kind of setting that whispered tradition and southern charm. But inside Helen, something else was whispering louder. She walked toward the window, pushing aside a sheer curtain, and stared out into the dark. A car engine hummed in the distance. Moments later, the sound of the front gate's code keypad beeped softly. He was home. She didn't move right away. The door opened with the grace of money and the weight of history, and in stepped Edward Carrington, tall, composed, expensive. His tailored navy blazer still held the scent of cigar smoke and cedarwood cologne. He didn't speak as he entered, just dropped his keys into the brass bowl by the door and hung his coat like a ritual he no longer thought about. "Long day?" Helen asked gently, her voice calm, too calm. Edward glanced at her, his face unreadable. Meetings ran late. He walked into the dining room, paused, then gave the table a once-over. "Is someone joining us?" Helen blinked. "No, it's just us." He pulled out his chair, but didn't sit. "You didn't have to go all out." "It's Thursday," she said with a small smile. "We used to sit down on Thursdays." His eyes flickered toward the meal, then back to her. That was a long time ago. Helen's breath caught for a moment, but she swallowed it down like a stone. "Well, I thought I'd bring it back." Edward finally sat. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't ask about their children, who were already upstairs, headphones in, faces glowing in the light of their screens. He simply reached for his water glass, took a sip, and stared ahead. Helen served him quietly, every motion precise. Her hands, once used to sketch intricate patterns on design boards, now moved like those of a well-trained assistant. "I saw the invitation on your desk," she said, voice light but deliberate. "The Stanton Foundation Gala." He didn't flinch. "It's just another fundraiser." "I always liked that event," she added. "B. Stanton throws a beautiful party." Edward set his fork down slowly. "It's more business this year than social." She nodded, carefully. "And you're bringing?" He took a moment too long to answer. "I'm bringing Paige." There it was. Helen didn't blink, didn't let the silence crush her. Instead, she folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. "She's your assistant," she said evenly, as if stating a weather report. "She's the head of our PR team now," Edward replied. "She knows how to work a room." "And I don't?" His gaze met hers. "You haven't been to one of these in years. You haven't invited me in years." The air thickened like fog over the marsh. Edward leaned back in his chair, gaze distant, as if the conversation was a nuisance he hadn't budgeted time for. "It's nothing personal, Helen. It's just people expect a certain image." And there it was again, quieter but crueler. Image. Helen stood slowly. Her chair made no sound as it moved. "Of course, you have to protect the brand." Edward didn't respond. He reached for his fork again and resumed eating. She turned away, her face calm, heart raging. She walked into the kitchen, leaned on the counter, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't anger. It wasn't even pain. It was something colder. Disbelief. Not at what he'd said, but at the fact that part of her had expected anything else. Later that night, after Edward had gone upstairs without a word, no thank you, no good night, Helen stood in the laundry room, folding his monogrammed dress shirts, her fingers tracing the fabric like memory. She opened his dry cleaning bag and caught sight of a receipt peeking from the inside pocket of a blazer. She almost didn't pull it out, but she did. Paige Landon. Written in soft cursive. The boutique's name was familiar. So was the date. The same night he said he had a board dinner. She set the receipt down on the counter and stared at it for a long time. The truth wasn't shocking. It was confirming. Helen walked to the hallway mirror. She hadn't looked at herself, really looked, in a long time. Not the kind of glance you give before heading out to pick up groceries or drive the kids to practice. She took in the fine lines around her eyes, the softness around her jaw, the way her hair had faded, not with time, but with permission. She had let it. She had let everything fade quietly to fit the shape of Edward's life. And the worst part? He wasn't even looking anymore. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Lorraine lit up the screen. "Tea tomorrow. I miss your face." Helen stared at it. Her thumb hovered for a moment, then typed, "Yes, need to talk." As she hit send, she looked at the receipt again, now resting on top of the dryer. She didn't feel rage. Not yet. Just an ache. The ache of someone finally realizing they've been left behind. Not suddenly, but slowly, deliberately, over years. And now, there was a gala, an invitation she hadn't been given, a spotlight she had been written out of. But something stirred. Not pride, not ego. Something older, something buried, something that whispered, "You are not done." Upstairs, the sound of Edward's footsteps crossed the hallway. A bedroom door clicked closed. Helen picked up the receipt one last time, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her old sketchbook. She had a meeting tomorrow, and maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be about tea. If this story touched your soul, hit the like button to let us know, and drop a comment sharing where you're from. You might just discover a neighbor watching along with you right now. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another heart-stirring story like this one. The following morning, the Charleston sun filtered softly through the gauzy curtains of Helen's bedroom. The house was still, too still, the kind of silence that follows a night of unspoken truths. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair slowly, thoughtfully, watching her own reflection like it was someone else's face. There was a quietness in her chest, but not peace. A pause. The moment before the music starts again. Only this time, she wouldn't be dancing to someone else's rhythm. Downstairs, the familiar clatter of breakfast plates echoed through the space. Caroline was already halfway through a slice of toast, her AirPods in, her expression vacant. Mason had his tablet propped up by the juice carton, laser-focused on a racing game. Typical morning. Everything as it should be. But Helen couldn't stop noticing the gap at the head of the table. Edward's chair. Empty. He had left early. Again. No note. No call. "Mom?" Caroline pulled one earbud out. "You okay?" Helen looked up, startled by her daughter's voice. "Yes," she said quickly. Then softer. "Just tired." Caroline nodded, unconvinced. "You look really pretty today." Helen blinked. It had been so long since someone said that to her, without it sounding like an obligation. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a hand over Caroline's shoulder. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. One new message. "Lorraine. Porch. Coffee. You owe me gossip. Bring a face." Helen smiled for the first time that morning. An hour later, she pulled up to Lorraine's boutique, the Threaded Magnolia, nestled between a charming antique bookstore and a bakery that always smelled like vanilla and warm secrets. Lorraine's boutique had always felt like a place untouched by time. Vintage mannequins in the windows, sunlight spilling across French armoires stacked with silks, the scent of lavender and wood polish. Lorraine met her on the porch with 2 steaming mugs. "I made the good stuff," she said, holding one out. "You look like you need it." "I really do," Helen sighed, accepting the cup. They sat in silence for a moment, the morning breeze brushing gently through the wind chimes. Lorraine looked over at her with raised brows. "Okay, spill. You texted me last night and used punctuation. That's always a sign." Helen took a slow sip, buying time. "He's taking Paige Landon to the Stanton Gala." Lorraine's face didn't flinch, but her voice did. "You're kidding." "No." Lorraine leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. "She's what, 28? 30? 26, PR assistant, fresh from some agency in Atlanta. And you're not going because—" Helen looked down into her coffee. "Because I wasn't invited." Lorraine muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like a prayer for patience. Helen's voice was quiet. "He said it's more of a business event this year, and that I don't really fit the image anymore." Lorraine stood, not suddenly, gracefully, but with purpose. She walked inside, and for a moment, Helen thought she had gone to calm herself. But she returned carrying a sketchbook. Not just any sketchbook. Helen's old portfolio. "You remember this?" Lorraine said, laying it across Helen's lap. "You left it here years ago, after the fall market event. Said you'd get back to it." Helen flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling slightly. Designs. Textures. Fabric notes. Color palettes inspired by magnolia blossoms, heirloom china, copper gas lamps. Her world. Once. "You used to design for women who wanted to be noticed," Lorraine said gently. "Not for men who wanted them invisible." Helen didn't respond, but her grip on the book tightened. "There's a fitting this afternoon," Lorraine continued, sitting back down. "Mrs. Stanton is coming in for her final gown check. You should be here." Helen looked up. "For what?" "To be seen. By her. By me. By yourself." Helen opened her mouth, then closed it. The wind picked up just slightly, stirring a strand of hair across her face. She didn't commit, but she didn't say no either. That afternoon, Lorraine's boutique buzzed with the hum of a steamer and the shuffle of fabrics being pressed into form. Helen stood off to the side, watching as Mrs. B. Stanton, a woman who carried authority with the same grace she wore her pearls, slipped into a deep emerald gown. "Oh, Lorraine," she said, inspecting herself in the mirror. "You've outdone yourself. Again." Lorraine smiled, then subtly motioned toward Helen. It was Helen's idea to soften the sleeves. Said it would bring out your posture and frame. Mrs. Stanton turned to her. "You? You're Helen Carrington?" Helen offered a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am." "My dear, I've heard your name for years. You used to design interiors, yes? And fabric lines. Helen hesitated, then answered, "I did, a while ago." B gave her a long look. Not judgmental, but evaluating. "Well, your eye's still sharp. Most women would have missed the shoulder line completely." Helen smiled softly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As Mrs. Stanton left with her assistants, Lorraine turned to Helen. "That was the door, honey." "What door?" "The one you just cracked open." Helen exhaled, feeling something stir that had been dormant for too long. That night, she stood in front of her bedroom closet, running her hand over the untouched dresses. Satin, lace, cotton. All silent witnesses to a woman who had stopped going out, stopped speaking up, stopped being visible. She glanced toward the bed. Edward was still not home. She turned back to the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't broken. She wasn't weak. She was waiting. But not for him. For herself. The doorbell rang downstairs. Strange. She descended quietly, opening the door to find a courier holding a simple white envelope. "Delivery for Mrs. Carrington." She took it. Closed the door. Inside, in Edward's handwriting. "Gala RSVP confirmed. Paige will attend as my guest. No need to coordinate wardrobe. No greeting. No explanation. Just logistics." Helen stood in the hallway for a long time, envelope in hand, heart steady. Then she walked into the kitchen, opened her sketchbook, and pulled out the boutique's card tucked between the pages. She flipped it over, wrote 4 words on the back. "I'd like a fitting." The next morning she'd walk through the boutique doors, not as Edward Carrington's wife, but as Helen, designer, woman, and soon, someone no one would forget. The measuring tape whispered across Helen's collarbone, soft and deliberate. Lorraine circled her like a sculptor, taking notes before the first chisel met the marble. The boutique's large fitting room was drenched in golden light from tall arched windows, casting shadows that danced along the polished wood floors. Helen stood still, arms slightly raised, wrapped in a soft muslin mock-up of the evening gown they were designing, a deep crimson silhouette that would hug her waist, fall gracefully at the hips, and move like water when she walked. "Still breathing?" Lorraine teased, adjusting a pin at Helen's side. "Barely," Helen said, voice tight. "It's been a long time since I let anyone measure me like this." "Then let this be the first time you do it for yourself," Lorraine replied, her tone warm but pointed. "Not for Edward. Not for anyone watching." Helen looked down at her reflection. The dress was still unfinished, but something about the way it skimmed her figure, even in raw fabric, felt promising. Her body hadn't changed much, but her presence, that was shifting. There was a soft knock on the door frame. "Lorraine?" a man's voice called from the front of the shop. "You've got a delivery out here, and a very lost-looking intern." Lorraine grinned. "That's my cousin Sam. Ignore the intern jab. He thinks he's funnier than he is." Helen arched an eyebrow as Lorraine excused herself, leaving Helen in front of the mirror. She traced her fingers along the neckline of the muslin, just above her heart. The woman in the mirror looked unfamiliar, but in the best way, like someone returning from far away. Moments later, a voice returned, but this time it came from just behind the fitting room curtain. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Sam said gently. Helen pulled the curtain open slightly, just enough to see him. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, dressed in a soft blue button-down rolled up at the sleeves, khakis dusted with what looked like sawdust. His smile was easy, but not performative, the kind that came from someone used to silence and company in equal measure. "Sam?" she said, offering a polite nod. He extended a hand. "Helen Carrington, right? I've seen your textile work. You used to be on the board for the Charleston Artisan Collective." She tilted her head, a little surprised. "I did, years ago. I'm surprised you know that." "I was a judge once for their fall showcase," he said, stepping just inside. "You had a piece. Hand-dyed silk panels inspired by marsh sunsets. Still remember them. Moved everyone in the room." Helen didn't know what to say. It had been so long since anyone spoke about her work like it still mattered. Like she still mattered. "Sorry," he added, holding up his hands. "Didn't mean to corner you. Lorraine said you were working on something big. Gala-worthy, I hear." Helen smiled faintly. "Something like that." He glanced down at the gown. "That color suits you. Strong without being loud." Helen's heart ticked a little faster. She changed the subject. "What do you do?" "Woodwork. Custom furniture mostly. Grew up around it. My dad was a cabinet maker. I guess I just never left the smell of sawdust behind." He rubbed his hands together absently. They were rougher than Edward's. Not polished, but grounded. Real. He stepped back. "Anyway, I'll leave you to it. Just nice seeing your work again." Helen nodded. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As he left, Lorraine returned with a new roll of fabric in her arms, grinning. "I see you met Sam." Helen avoided eye contact. "He's kind," she said quietly. That's what I keep telling him, but he insists on being single and emotionally available. It's exhausting." Helen laughed. A real laugh. It startled both of them. The fitting resumed in a quiet rhythm, pins and thread marking new beginnings. As Lorraine worked, Helen's thoughts drifted back to the envelope Edward had left, the sharp black ink spelling out Paige's name with such finality. She hadn't told Lorraine everything yet. Not about the receipt, not about the comment Edward made about her no longer fitting the image, but the fabric she was wrapped in seemed to remember. Every stitch, every seam, whispered back the parts she couldn't say aloud. That evening, Helen returned home just as the sun slipped below the rooftops. The house was warm with amber light, but hollow in energy. Caroline was on the back porch with a book, and Mason was in the kitchen building a Lego spaceship. "Dinner in 20, Helen called out as she set her bag down. Mason looked up. "You smell like flowers." Helen smiled. "Lavender and starch, probably." As she moved through the house, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The way she moved was different now. More present, less apologetic. Edward arrived home just after the table was set. He walked in briskly, cell phone still in hand, speaking in a clipped tone to someone about a client contract. He kissed the air near Helen's cheek, barely landing, and headed upstairs to change. Helen watched him go. No questions about her day, no notice of her slight change in posture or the quiet pride sitting just beneath her skin. He hadn't noticed her in a long time. She wondered if he ever really had. Over dinner, the children chatted about their day. Mason's science project, Caroline's upcoming field trip. Edward remained distracted, answering a text between bites. Helen watched it all from a slight distance, even as she sat among them. A strange sense of calm moved through her. Not coldness, not detachment. Clarity. After the dishes were cleared and the kids tucked in, she walked upstairs and stood outside their bedroom. Edward was already inside on a call again, pacing. She didn't enter. She turned, walked to her studio space instead. A small room with good light that had once been her sanctuary, now covered in dust and forgotten fabric bolts. She opened the window. The night air smelled of salt and jasmine. She rolled up her sleeves, unboxed her old supplies, and slowly began to arrange swatches across the work table. Deep reds, smoky golds, textures that spoke of movement, not stillness. As her hands moved, her mind cleared. And when she reached for her pencil and began sketching again, really sketching, it was like inhaling after years underwater. Downstairs, her phone buzzed. A message. Sam, if you ever need wood accents for that gown, I can carve lace better than you'd think. Just saying. Helen smiled at the screen, then set it aside. She didn't reply. Not yet. She went back to sketching. Back to herself. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something awaken. Not romance. Not yet. But possibility. Helen stepped into the threaded magnolia earlier than usual, the shop still wrapped in that morning hush before the first customer arrived. Sunlight poured through the front windows, casting soft beams across rows of antique dress forms and bolts of fabric draped like sleeping giants. She clutched her sketchbook tight to her chest. Not out of nervousness, but out of purpose. Today wasn't about watching from the mirror. It was about stepping in front of it. Lorraine was already at the back counter, sipping her espresso and flipping through order sheets. She looked up and smiled, but something in her eyes shifted the moment she saw Helen's expression. "You're ready," Lorraine said, without a single question. "I am," Helen nodded. "Let's finish the gown." They moved with quiet urgency, the kind shared between women who'd known both silence and survival. Lorraine draped the crimson fabric across the fitting pedestal and stepped back, arms crossed, measuring the distance between vision and reality. "By the time we're done," she said softly, "they won't just see you. They'll remember you." Helen exhaled slowly, letting that promise settle into her bones. They spent the morning shaping the dress. Lorraine adjusted the backline, lowered the waist, hand-stitched a delicate twist of embroidery across the bodice. Helen didn't just watch. She worked, pinning, cutting, smoothing seams. Her hands remembered the rhythm, the patience, the pride. And around noon, just as they were finalizing the hem, the bell above the door jingled. Helen glanced up. Sam. His shirt sleeves were rolled again, arms dusted faintly with cedar. He carried a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, polished to a golden sheen. "I come bearing gifts," he said, stepping carefully over a pile of folded tulle. "You do woodwork," Lorraine called from behind a curtain, "not Christmas deliveries." He ignored her and looked at Helen. "You said you wanted the neckline to feel like water. I figured maybe I could help." He set the box down and opened it. Inside were carved accents, not bulky or heavy, but feather-light overlays, lace patterns, hand-carved into thin, flexible wood, shaped like floral vines. The texture was warm, feminine, timeless. Helen reached out, fingers grazing the surface. "You made these?" He nodded. "Based on one of your old designs from the Artisan Collective archives. It stuck with me." She didn't say anything at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the carvings, but her throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. Sam tilted his head. "You okay?" Helen looked up. "It's just, I forgot what it feels like to have someone see me for who I am, not just where I fit." Lorraine peeked out again. "Y'all want a moment, or should I pretend not to exist?" Helen laughed, shaking her head. You can stay. This moment's mine, either way. Sam stayed for an hour. He helped Lorraine position the wooden lace, blending it into the neckline, like it had always belonged there. He didn't hover, didn't push. He just helped, quietly, like someone who knew healing didn't need noise. It needed presence. After he left, Lorraine looked at Helen with something unspoken behind her eyes. "Does Edward know you're doing this?" she asked finally. Helen paused. "He knows I'm attending, but not how." Helen shook her head. "And I don't think he cares." Lorraine leaned in. "Good. Then he won't see it coming." That night, Helen sat in her studio, the nearly finished gown hanging from the mannequin like a secret waiting to be revealed. She lit a single candle beside her sketchpad and opened to a blank page. This time, she didn't draw. She wrote, not a journal entry, not a letter, a promise. "I am not what you said I was. I am not a shadow. I am not an accessory. I am a story you thought no one would read again. But I have the pen now." As she closed the book, her phone buzzed. Edward. "Confirmed dinner with Stanton Firm, Thursday night. Paige joining. Wear something elegant if you're attending." Helen stared at the message. Not, "Would you like to come?" Not, "I want you by my side." Just instructions. A placeholder. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The next morning, as Helen dropped Mason off at school and waved goodbye to Caroline rushing out with her backpack, she passed the dining room and paused. Edward's jacket hung across the back of a chair. His phone was charging beside it. On the screen, lit up and open, an email. She glanced once. Then again. Subject line. Stanton Gala. Final RSVP. Mr. Carrington plus Ms. Paige Landon. There was no mention of Helen, no line for a spouse, no extra seat. He hadn't even planned to pretend. Her hands didn't shake. Her stomach didn't drop. But something inside her clicked shut. Not broken. Finished. Helen turned, walked out the door, and drove to Lorraine's. When she stepped inside, the gown was waiting. So was Lorraine. And so was Sam. "You ready?" Lorraine asked. Helen walked over to the pedestal and stepped onto it without hesitation. "I'm not just ready," she said, her voice low and even. "I'm done hiding." Lorraine smiled. "Let's make the final cut." As the scissors glided across the last thread, Helen watched her reflection. She didn't see a wife. She didn't see a woman discarded. She saw a reckoning in silk and scarlet. The gala was days away, but the storm had already begun to gather. The Stanton Gala was 4 days away, but to Helen, time had begun to feel liquid, like it was slipping between her fingers in slow motion. Every hour seemed to stretch and pull, whispering questions she couldn't ignore. Would people recognize her? Would he? Would she? She stood in the studio again that morning, just after sunrise, barefoot on the cool hardwood floor. The gown hung in the golden light like a living thing now, complete. Crimson silk, sculpted lace, the subtle wood-carved accents from Sam's hands woven along the neckline and trailing the back in delicate vines. It wasn't just a dress anymore. It was a declaration. Her phone buzzed across the table. A message from Lorraine. "Final fitting. You ready to set the world on fire?" Helen replied simply, "I'm not going to burn it. I'm going to outshine it." She arrived at the boutique early, and Lorraine was already steaming the fabric, her usual chatter replaced by focus. Helen stepped into the gown for the first time with the zipper fully closed, the heels on, the jewelry in place. Lorraine adjusted the shoulders, then stepped back, pressing her fingers to her lips. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That man's about to regret every quiet dinner he skipped." Helen gave a small smile. "Let's hope he doesn't pass out before dessert." "Paige might." Helen looked at her reflection again. She didn't see revenge. She didn't even see Edward. She saw presence. She saw a woman who had been erased slowly, then chose to write herself back into her own life. Then, the boutique door opened. Sam. He paused when he saw her, his breath visibly catching in his chest. He said nothing for a moment, just took her in. "Wow," he said finally, voice low. "I've built things that have held their shape for years, but I've never seen anything stand like this." Helen turned toward him, curious. "Like what?" "Like a woman who just remembered she built her own foundation." Their eyes held for a beat too long. Helen's fingers twitched slightly at her side. Then she laughed, soft, unguarded. "I don't even know if I'm nervous anymore," she admitted. Sam walked closer, slow and careful, his gaze never leaving hers. "You should be," he said. "Not because of them, because of you. Because this moment matters." Helen nodded, exhaling. "It does." Then he leaned in, brushing one hand lightly against the carved detail at her neckline. "This," he said, "this was always in you. I just gave it a frame." She didn't reply. Couldn't. Instead, she lowered her eyes, letting the silence rest between them, like something sacred. After a moment, Lorraine broke the spell with a loud clatter in the back room. Sam stepped back, cleared his throat. "I'll leave you ladies to it." Before he turned to go, he paused again at the door. "Helen?" he said gently. "Yes?" "Whatever happens at that gala, just know, some of us already see you." And then he was gone. That night, Helen sat at the kitchen table, watching Mason draw spaceships on scrap paper and Caroline scroll through a playlist for the car ride to school tomorrow. Edward wasn't home yet. Again. But this time, it didn't sting. It barely registered. When the garage door finally hummed open, she didn't flinch. When the door shut and he walked in, she kept her gaze on her tea. "Long day," Edward muttered, setting his briefcase down. "I imagine so," she replied without looking up. He didn't comment, just poured himself a drink and sat at the end of the table. A beat passed. "You haven't said anything about the gala," he said, casually. Helen looked up. Calm, composed. "I didn't think you wanted me to." He hesitated. "You're still coming, aren't you?" "I suppose that depends." "On what?" "Whether I'm a guest or an inconvenience." Edward frowned. "Don't be dramatic." Helen set her tea down gently. "You made the RSVP without me. You sent an envelope addressed only to Paige. You haven't asked what I'll wear, where I'll sit, or if I'll be okay walking into that room after being invisible beside you for years." He looked irritated. "It's business, Helen. You've said yourself you hate those events." "I hated being erased from them." A long silence followed. Then, Edward leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "So you're making this a scene?" Helen smiled, but not the way he expected. "No, I'm making it a memory." The next 3 days moved with quiet intensity. Helen didn't call Lorraine. She didn't message Sam. She simply lived. She walked the kids to school, She bought flowers for the foyer. She pulled down her old sewing machine and fixed a hemline on Caroline's dress shirt for choir. She didn't tell anyone what she was feeling, but it showed in how she moved, in how she dressed, in how she no longer apologized for taking up space. Then the night arrived, the Stanton Foundation Gala. Charleston's finest filled the city's grandest hall, chandeliers glowing, laughter bouncing off the marble, champagne flutes raised like they held secrets. Edward entered with Paige on his arm, both dressed in matching navy and silver. He walked tall, confident, unaware, until the room fell silent. It happened slowly at first. A murmur near the entrance, a turned head, then another, and then Helen. She stepped into the ballroom like she belonged there, because she did. The crimson gown shimmered under the lights, moving with her, like it remembered every year she'd stayed quiet. Her hair swept up in elegant ease, her neckline bare save for the delicate carved lace, catching every glimmer of gold around the room. She didn't look toward Edward. She didn't need to. And every eye was on her, every breath held, and in that perfect, cinematic pause, she smiled, not for them, not for him, for herself, because she had arrived, and there was no turning back. The room didn't just go quiet, it shifted. Helen didn't walk into the Stanton Gala like a guest. She walked in like the room had been waiting for her. Every head turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne flutes were lowered as whispers rippled across the floor like wind through silk. She moved with ease, each step deliberate, heels clicking softly against marble like a quiet drumbeat announcing her return. And still, she hadn't looked at him. Edward stood across the room, frozen mid-greeting. His smile faltered as Helen's image burned into the corners of every camera, every gaze, every whispered rumor. Beside him, Paige stiffened. The glittering navy gown she wore, sleek, expensive, clearly chosen to impress, now looked muted against Helen's crimson, like a background prop, trying to outshine the spotlight. Helen made her way toward the center of the room, nodding politely at familiar faces, old clients, board members, neighbors who had once pitied her politely in grocery store aisles. She didn't stop for anyone, didn't stall, until she reached the center. And finally, her eyes met Edward's. There it was. Shock, recognition, and something close to panic. "Helen," he said, voice caught halfway between surprise and control. "You came." She tilted her head slightly, a soft smile brushing her lips. "I was invited, wasn't I?" Paige stepped forward, smiling tight. "Helen, you look stunning." Helen turned to her, kind and cool. "Thank you, Paige. You too. Navy's always been your color." It landed, soft, subtle, dead center. Paige blinked, forced a polite laugh, and took a sip of her champagne. Edward cleared his throat. There are donors arriving, and I told Stanton we'd meet near the terrace." Helen nodded once. "By all means, I'll find my seat." She turned before either of them could respond, and walked away, the back of her gown trailing like a banner in the breeze. She didn't look back, not once. Inside, her heart was a storm. Not of fear, but of release. For years, she'd walked into rooms like she was apologizing for the space she took up. Now, the space bent around her. As she reached the open bar, a voice beside her said, "Now that was cinematic." She turned. Sam. He stood there in a dark charcoal suit, shirt slightly unbuttoned at the top, no tie. Clean and timeless but effortless, like he'd wandered out of an art exhibit. His eyes were soft but sharp, always scanning, always listening. "You came," she said. He smiled. "Of course. Lorraine practically shoved me into the car." Helen laughed under her breath. "She's good at that." Sam leaned closer, voice low. "You don't just look beautiful tonight, Helen. You look whole." The words hit somewhere unexpected, not because they were flirty, but because they were true. She swallowed gently, then glanced around the room. "I was afraid I'd walk in and feel like a fraud." Sam tilted his head. "And do you?" She shook her head. "I feel like I was always meant to walk in like this." He held her gaze for a beat. "Then why did it take so long?" Helen didn't answer right away. She looked across the room, at Edward, surrounded now by board members and socialites. Paige beside him, smile fixed, glass full, gaze flicking toward Helen every few seconds, like a compass pulled off course. "Because I thought I had to earn his approval," Helen said quietly, like it was some prize I hadn't worked hard enough for. Sam's voice was gentle. "And now?" Helen turned back to him. "Now, I know I don't need it." Before Sam could reply, an older woman approached. Bea Stanton herself. A vision in silver silk and diamond earrings. "Helen Carrington," Bea said with a slow, warm smile. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you've been planning this moment for months." Helen offered her hand. "It's an honor to be here, Mrs. Stanton." "Oh, don't be formal. Anyone who can silence a room like that on arrival doesn't need to pretend to be small." Bea glanced at the gown, then at Sam, then back at Helen. "Lorraine told me you were behind this design." "I was." "Well, I'm giving a speech later," Bea said. "And if you'd be willing, I'd love to mention your return to design. The community could use a little elegance again." Helen felt her breath catch. "That would be an honor." "Good," Bea said, turning to walk away. "Then it's done." Helen stood still for a moment, the world around her suddenly louder. Music picking up, laughter rising, camera shutters clicking from across the room. Sam leaned close. "You just got endorsed by Charleston royalty." Helen looked up at him. "Is it too late to faint?" He grinned. "Only if you do it gracefully. I'll catch you either way." She laughed, but her chest tightened just enough to remind her this night wasn't over. There was still a conversation that hadn't happened. She turned toward the ballroom doors and began to walk toward the terrace. Edward stood alone near the railing, drink in hand, watching the skyline. Paige was nowhere in sight. Helen stepped up beside him, calm and poised. He didn't look at her at first. "I didn't know you'd wear red," he said quietly. Helen looked out over the city lights. "I didn't choose it for you." Silence. Then he finally turned. "You made quite an entrance." "I wasn't trying to." "You were seen, Helen. That much is clear." She looked at him fully now. "Funny, isn't it? After all this time, all I ever wanted was to be seen." Edward's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time for a scene." "I'm not making one," she said. "I'm making a point." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "You embarrassed Paige. She wasn't prepared for you to show up like this. She shouldn't have come expecting me to stay small." Edward set his drink down hard. "You've made your position clear." Helen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I haven't even started." Then she turned, and this time, she didn't look back. Inside, the music swelled, and for the first time in years, Helen danced. Not to please, not to blend, but to remember who she'd always been, and who she was finally becoming. The last notes of the jazz quartet faded beneath the clinking of glasses and murmured conversations, but Helen was still swaying, not to the rhythm of the music, but to the pulse of her own heartbeat. She stood just beyond the main ballroom, on the edge of the gallery hallway where the crowd thinned, the hush of polished conversation giving way to space and breath. Behind her, the gala buzzed, but out here, it was quiet enough to think, or at least, it had been. "I thought you might disappear after that last dance." Sam's voice came, warm and just amused enough to settle her nerves. Helen turned slightly. "I needed air." "You needed space," he corrected gently, stepping up beside her. "There's a difference." She looked over at him. The lighting softened the sharpness of his features, and yet he looked more certain than ever. Grounded, a contrast to the flash and spin behind them. "You've been watching me all night," she said, not accusing, just observant. Sam didn't flinch. "Only because it's the first time I've seen someone walk into a room they were meant to own." Helen's lips parted, then closed. She wasn't used to that kind of praise. Not without a hook, not without a price. She crossed her arms loosely and leaned against the column. "I think Edward's regretting bringing Paige tonight." "I think Edward's regretting a lot more than that," Sam said, tilting his head. "But that's not your weight to carry." "I used to think it was." Helen looked ahead, eyes unfocused. His moods, his silence, his choices. "I thought if I just held still long enough, I'd earn back the version of him I married. And now? Now I realize that version never existed. Not really." Sam let that settle between them before speaking again. "You're allowed to grieve that." Helen exhaled. "I don't know if it's grief, or just release." They stood in silence for a moment. Then, from the ballroom, Bea Stanton's voice rose as she stepped up to the podium. The gala's annual speech had begun, a moment to honor the community's supporters, announce future initiatives, and offer the spotlight to those who shaped Charleston's cultural identity. Helen turned to go back in, but Sam gently touched her wrist. "Wait." She looked at him. "I think she's about to mention you." Helen raised a brow. "How do you—" But then Bea's voice echoed into the hall. "And before we close, I want to recognize someone who reminded us all tonight that grace doesn't arrive loudly, but powerfully, and that reinvention isn't only for the young or reckless, but for the brave." Murmurs stirred. Bea continued. "Some of you may know Helen Carrington as the wife of Edward Carrington, but I'd like you to know her as something else, a creator, a designer, an artist, and tonight, the very breath of elegance." Helen's breath caught in her chest. Bea smiled, voice rich with warmth. "She designed the gown she's wearing tonight. She returned not for approval, but because her voice, her vision, demanded space again, and I, for one, am grateful she allowed us to witness it." Applause rose, not just polite, but present, full, real. Helen turned to Sam, dazed. "Did you—" He lifted both hands in surrender. "I might have told Bea what you meant to this city." She remembered. She just needed reminding. Helen swallowed hard. "You didn't have to do that." Sam stepped closer, voice lower. "You needed to hear it." Inside, the applause faded. But Helen didn't move. She felt as if she'd just been given something she didn't know she'd lost. Validation that didn't come wrapped in expectation. Then, footsteps, fast, sharp, Paige. Her heels echoed down the hallway as she approached, her expression unreadable. Helen straightened, prepared for a comment, an insult dressed as civility, but Paige stopped short, folded her arms, and looked Helen in the eye. "That dress," she said, her voice steady, "is magnificent." Helen blinked. "Thank you. And I imagine you know exactly what you're doing." Helen met her gaze, calm. "I'm not here for you, Paige. I'm not here against you either." Paige tilted her head. "Then why come at all?" Helen's voice was soft but unwavering. "Because I deserve to." A long pause. Then Paige glanced toward the ballroom. "He's panicking. He thought this night would be clean, simple. He thought I was the next chapter." "You're not," Helen said gently. "You're a bookmark." Paige looked back, the weight of the words hitting her deeper than she expected. Then, after a long beat, she stepped back. "You're not who I expected." "And neither are you," Helen replied. "But we're both here now. Make it mean something." Without another word, Paige walked away, her pace slower this time. Not defeated, just rethinking. Sam watched her go. "Well, that was more civil than I expected." "She's not the villain," Helen said. "She's just reading the wrong script." Sam smiled. "You rewriting yours?" Helen turned toward the open doors, back to the lights, the buzz, the sound of the world finally turning in her direction. "I already have," she said. This is just the first chapter they get to see. And with that, she walked back inside, a little taller, a little lighter, ready for whatever came next. Helen sat in her car outside the boutique the next morning, fingers curled loosely around a warm coffee cup, eyes tracing the lettering on the window. The threaded magnolia. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the air was already thick with that familiar Charleston heaviness, the kind that pressed gently on your shoulders, not quite oppressive, but impossible to ignore. She hadn't slept much, not out of regret, but from adrenaline. The gala played in her mind like a reel she couldn't stop. B. Stanton's words, Sam's steady voice beside her, Paige's unexpected concession, and Edward's silence, which had lingered long after the night ended. She'd left without saying goodbye. It felt right. Helen stepped out of the car and unlocked the shop. Lorraine had given her the keys weeks ago, just in case, but today was the first time she'd used them before sunrise. Inside, the boutique was still and sacred. Dresses stood in quiet rows like witnesses, sunlight slowly spilling in across polished floors and bolts of silk. She walked to the work table, running her hands over fabric swatches, pausing at a sketch she'd left unfinished, a soft lilac gown with a low back and bell sleeves, inspired by a conversation with a widow who'd recently rediscovered dating. Helen smiled faintly. She pulled her sketchpad closer, sat down, and began to draw. It felt easy, like her hands were finally hers again. The bell above the door chimed softly. Lorraine stepped in, 2 coffees in hand, sunglasses perched on her head as usual. "You beat me here. That's got to be a sign of the apocalypse." Helen looked up, smiling. "Couldn't sleep." "I figured. That's why I brought the strong stuff." Lorraine handed her a cup and sank into the stool beside her, heels kicked off like they didn't belong in the room. They sipped in silence for a minute. Then Lorraine leaned her elbow on the table. "So, did he say anything?" Helen didn't have to ask who. "No," she said. "He didn't have to." Lorraine raised an eyebrow. "He kept his distance," Helen explained. "Didn't make a scene. But I saw it in his eyes." Confusion, regret, maybe even fear. Fear of losing you. Helen shook her head. Fear of not being able to control me anymore. Lorraine let out a slow whistle. Well, he's about 10 years too late. Helen looked down at the gown sketch again. I think I'm ready, Lorraine. For what, honey? To take my name off the shelf. I want to relaunch my line. For real. Not just as a side project. As me. Lorraine's eyes lit up. Oh, you mean Helen Sinclair is back? Helen hesitated. Maybe not back. Maybe she never really left. She was just buried, Lorraine grinned. Then it's time to dig her out, dust her off, and send her strutting down King Street. Helen laughed. Careful, or I'll actually do it. You'd better. The mood lightened, but beneath it, a fire burned. A readiness. Then, Lorraine's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, then turned the screen toward Helen. It was a message from Edward. Have her call me when she's free. We need to talk. Helen stared at the words. Not please. Not when you're ready. Just a demand. Lorraine raised a brow. You want to? Helen exhaled. No, but I think I need to. Lorraine nodded. Then go in on your own terms. Later that afternoon, Helen found herself standing outside the Carrington firm's office, a building she used to enter weekly, if not daily, when she played the role of the polished wife, smiling in boardrooms, hosting charity events, carrying the weight of Edward's image without ever truly being invited into the strategy. Now, she walked in like a client. The receptionist blinked when she saw her. Mrs. Carrington. Helen, she corrected gently. Just Helen. Edward met her in his corner office. The view was the same, Charleston's skyline framed like a painting. But something in the air had shifted. He stood when she entered, but didn't approach. You look different. I am different. A long pause. Then he gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. She didn't take it. I came because you said we needed to talk, she said. So talk. Edward ran a hand over his jaw. Last night, you made an impact. That wasn't my goal. Maybe not. But you did. Helen waited. He walked around to the front of his desk, leaning back against it. People ask questions. About the dress. About us. About you. And what did you say? I told them the truth. That you've always had a gift. That you're finding your own space again. Helen tilted her head. Funny. You spent the last few years making sure I didn't have any. Edward sighed. I know. There it was. Not an apology, but the closest he'd ever come. I didn't know how to handle it, he continued. You disappearing into yourself. The distance between us. I thought if I just focused on work, on Paige, it would fill the silence. Helen felt the sting of that name, but she didn't show it. And did it? She asked. Edward hesitated. No. Silence stretched. Then he looked at her again. Are you leaving me? Helen looked out the window. The city hummed below, alive and ordinary. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I know I'm not staying just because it's easier. Edward nodded slowly. What about the kids? I'll always be their mother. That won't change. He stepped forward slightly. I didn't expect you to become this. Helen met his eyes. That's because you stopped seeing me a long time ago. Then she turned, walked to the door, and paused. I'll let you know when I've made my decision. But in the meantime, don't assume silence means surrender. And with that, she walked out, leaving Edward alone in a room that had always been his until now. Back in the car, Helen let herself breathe, not in pain, not in fear, but in power. A woman no longer waiting for permission to live. The hum of Helen's car engine barely registered as she drove down East Bay Street. Cobblestones blurred beneath her tires, the harbor glinting silver in the late afternoon sun. But her mind was far from the water. Edward's words echoed in her ears like distant thunder. "Are you leaving me?" He had finally said the quiet part out loud. But she hadn't answered in absolutes. Not because she was unsure, but because some endings didn't happen with explosions. They eroded, slow and silent, until the only thing left was a decision made in stillness. She pulled into the drive of her childhood home, now Lorraine's. A wide porch draped in ivy, wind chimes singing in the breeze. It had been her refuge growing up, and today she needed that stillness more than ever. Lorraine opened the door before Helen knocked. "You didn't call, so I figured you needed tea or tequila, or both." Helen gave a tired laugh and stepped inside. The familiar scent of lavender and old books wrapped around her like a quilt. "I talked to Edward." Lorraine didn't react with surprise, just nodded and poured 2 glasses of sweet tea, no questions asked. Helen sank into the same armchair she used to curl up in after high school dances, where she once cried over college rejections and wedding plans that never felt quite her own. "He asked if I'm leaving him," she said finally. Lorraine passed her the glass. "And what did you say?" "I said I didn't know yet." Lorraine leaned against the doorframe. "But do you?" Helen looked at her reflection in the window. "I think I do." Silence. Then Lorraine said softly, "It's okay to say it out loud, Helen. You don't owe him forever." Helen set the glass down. "I'm not scared of being alone. I'm scared of the cost. The kids, the narrative, the judgment." "You think people didn't judge you when you stayed all those years?" That landed. Helen closed her eyes, breathing in the truth. Later that evening, she drove home to the Carrington house. Still technically hers, but it no longer felt like home. The lights were on, but the warmth had long since drained from the walls. As she stepped inside, she found Caroline at the dining table, flipping through a school project. "Hey, sweetheart," Helen said gently, brushing her daughter's curls back as she leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Hi, Mom." Caroline looked up with hesitant eyes. "Dad said you two had a meeting." Helen hesitated. "We talked, yes." "Are you mad at him?" "No," Helen said honestly. "But I am different now. And sometimes, when people change, it makes things confusing." Caroline studied her. "Is it my fault?" Helen's heart cracked open. "Oh, baby. No, not even a little. This isn't about you or Mason. This is about me making sure I'm being honest, with myself and with the life I want." Caroline nodded slowly. "You looked really happy at the gala." Helen blinked. "You saw pictures?" "Dad was on his laptop in the kitchen. I saw your dress. You looked like a queen." Helen hugged her daughter tight. "Thank you. That night reminded me I could be more than someone's shadow." Upstairs, Helen found an envelope on her vanity, addressed in Edward's handwriting. Inside, divorce papers. No letter, no explanation, just a signature line, already signed on his end. Her hands trembled only for a moment. He was doing what he always did, controlling the narrative, making the first move so he could say he had the strength to walk away. But this time, she wasn't playing along. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She didn't feel small. She walked downstairs and texted Lorraine. "It's happening." Lorraine replied within seconds. "I'll call my attorney. You don't have to do this alone." The next morning, Helen stood outside the Threaded Magnolia before opening hours. Sam was already there, unpacking a delivery at the back of the shop. She called out, "You always beat me here?" He turned, squinting against the light. "Only when I can't sleep." Helen stepped closer, folding her arms. "You okay?" He paused. "I've been thinking about something." Helen waited. "Last night, I was driving home," he said, "and I passed that old community center on Calhoun, the one we talked about turning into a co-op studio. I remember. I keep thinking we could actually do it. A real design space. You, me, local artists, seamstresses, apprentices. A school, maybe. A movement." Helen felt the idea bloom inside her like spring after a long winter. "You'd really do that with me?" she asked. Sam's eyes softened. "I don't want to just watch you rebuild, Helen. I want to help, if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked into the shop, over to her work table, and picked up the sketch she'd finished the day before. The lilac gown. She turned it around and held it out to Sam. "This one's going to be our launch piece." He smiled. "Then let's make it unforgettable." And for the first time in years, Helen felt it. Not just hope, but momentum. She wasn't unraveling. She was being stitched back together. Stronger. Brighter. Herself. The morning air was thick with jasmine and purpose. Helen stood outside the old brick building on Calhoun Street, the faded letters of Charleston Creative Arts Center still clinging to the wall like a forgotten promise. Ivy crept along the edges. The roof sagged slightly, and one window had been boarded shut. But to Helen, it looked like possibility. Sam pulled up beside her in his vintage green pickup, coffee in hand, sleeves rolled, eyes lit with quiet excitement. "You sure about this?" he asked, walking up beside her. Helen didn't answer right away. She was watching the light move across the glass, imagining a runway here, sketch tables there, and walls covered in color. A place that breathed, not just style, but second chances. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. Sam handed her the coffee. "Then let's make some magic." Inside, the building was dusty, dim, and echoing. But Helen's eyes skipped past the cracks in the ceiling and the scuffed wood floors. She saw potential, space, a canvas. And that was all she needed. "This place needs work," she said, stepping over a broken tile. "It does," Sam replied. "But so did we." She turned to look at him. That wasn't flirtation. It was truth. And something inside her softened. Later that day, back at Threaded Magnolia, Helen was bent over the mannequin, pinning delicate fabric across the frame of the lilac gown, when Caroline burst through the door. "Mom!" Helen looked up, startled. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Caroline's cheeks were flushed, her school bag still slung over one shoulder. "Dad came to school today. He pulled Mason out of gym and said we were going to have dinner at the club this weekend, like everything was normal." Helen set her pins down slowly. "He didn't tell me he was planning anything." "He told Mason you were going through a phase," Caroline said, her voice tightening. "Like you were just
confused or something. Helen exhaled, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric. Okay. Thank you for telling me. Caroline stepped closer. You're not confused, right? No, baby. Helen knelt to her daughter's height, meeting her eyes. I've never been clearer in my life. Caroline's voice cracked.
I don't want to go back to how it was, when you were always tired and quiet and sad. Helen pulled her into a hug, holding her close. We won't go back. I promise. That night, after the kids were asleep, Helen sat in her bedroom, the one she hadn't yet cleared out, though her belongings were now split between the house and Lorraine's guest room. She held the divorce papers in her lap again, the weight of them no longer heavy, just final. She reached for a pen. Her hand hovered over the page, and then she signed, clean, decisive. Just as she set the pen down, her phone buzzed. A text from Edward. We need to talk. Just us. Please. She stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. My terms. The next day, they met in a quiet corner of the waterfront park, where the breeze off the harbor kept the heat bearable and the benches offered enough space to not feel like a confrontation. Edward was already there when she arrived, seated with his sleeves rolled up and sunglasses perched on his head like an afterthought. Helen sat beside him, legs crossed, sunglasses on. She didn't say anything first. I saw the building on Calhoun, he said. I figured you would. You're serious about it. I'm serious about everything now. He leaned back, arms resting along the top of the bench. You've changed. No, Helen said, looking out over the water. You just never looked close enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why didn't you fight me harder back then? Helen blinked, turning to face him fully. Fight you for what, Edward? For space in my own life? For a sliver of your attention between meetings and social functions? I thought you were happy. You thought a lot of things. That I was content to shrink. That silence meant approval. That my presence beside you was enough to keep me fulfilled. She shook her head. You weren't listening. And I stopped talking. Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. I messed it up. I see that now. You didn't just mess up a marriage, she said quietly. You overlooked a person. For years. His jaw flexed. You asked if I'm leaving you, she continued. You had the answer in your hands the moment you dropped those papers on my vanity without a word. I was trying to make it easier. For you. Edward didn't argue. I don't hate you, Helen said after a long silence. But I also don't need you. And that difference, that's freedom. He turned toward her, slowly. And Sam? Her brow rose. What about him? You're replacing me? Helen laughed, soft and sad. Sam isn't a replacement. He's just someone who sees me. The way you never tried to. Edward nodded slowly. Then I guess this is goodbye. Helen stood. No, this is closure. And she walked away, heels clicking softly against the stone, the harbor wind tugging at her dress like a farewell. She didn't cry. And she didn't falter. She didn't turn around. Because when you finally step into the life you were meant to live, you don't look back. The scent of fresh paint clung to the air, mingling with the rich aroma of brewed coffee and something Helen couldn't quite name. Anticipation. Inside the newly renovated space on Calhoun Street, sunlight streamed through the now polished windows, casting wide golden bars across bolts of fabric, drafting tables, and mannequins that lined the walls like silent collaborators. The transformation was nearly complete. The old Charleston Creative Arts Center had become Studio Sinclair. Helen stood at the entrance, her fingers trailing along the edge of a new brass plaque mounted on the wall, designed for revival. The opening gala was 2 weeks away. Invitations had gone out, local press was buzzing, and Helen had never felt more alive. But beneath the momentum, something else stirred. Not fear exactly, but a question. One she hadn't dared voice. Sam entered from the back hallway, sleeves rolled, carrying a box of lighting fixtures. "Remind me again why we didn't hire more help." Helen smirked. "Because you insisted on being hands-on." He set the box down with a mock groan. "I thought we were designing a studio, not staging a Broadway production." "It's Charleston," Helen replied, walking toward him. "Every event's a production." He wiped his hands on a cloth, then glanced around. "It's starting to feel real." "It is real." Sam looked at her, more serious now. "So are we?" Helen blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer. "I mean, is this just a business partnership, a shared passion? Or is there something else here we haven't named yet?" Her breath hitched. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because hearing it out loud meant confronting what she'd kept at arm's length. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she said honestly. Sam nodded slowly. "I'm not asking for a label or a promise, just honesty. I don't want to step into something new just because it feels safe after something else collapsed." He met her gaze. "Helen, nothing about you is looking for safety. You're not rebuilding your life. You're rewriting it. That takes courage. I just want to know if there's room for me in that story." Helen looked down at her hands, still dusted with chalk. "There might be," she whispered. "But I need to find out if I can truly stand alone before I choose to stand with someone again." Sam offered a soft smile. "That's more than fair." Just then, Lorraine swept in, her signature red lipstick immaculate, carrying 2 shopping bags and a to-go box that smelled like heaven. "I come bearing sustenance and sarcasm," she declared, placing the food on the nearest table. "And news." Helen raised a brow. "Good or bad?" Lorraine pulled out her phone. "The Post-Courier wants an exclusive interview before the launch." And Edward's name came up. Helen stiffened. "He's trying to position himself as a supporter of women-led initiatives," Lorraine said, air quoting with both hands. "He wants the story to spin like this was all part of some mutual journey." Helen closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he does." Sam stepped aside, letting the moment unfold between the 2 women. Lorraine crossed her arms. "So, what are you going to do?" Helen walked to the window, looking out over the street, watching strangers pass, unaware they were part of her reinvention. She thought of the years she gave away, silently, to a man who didn't hear her, see her, or stand beside her. She thought of Caroline and Mason, of her first sketchbook, of the mirror she hadn't dared look into for years. And then she turned back. "I'm going to tell the truth." Lorraine nodded. "Then we set the record straight." That afternoon, Helen sat with the Post-Courier journalist in a quiet corner of the studio. Sam had stepped out. Lorraine remained nearby, pretending to be busy with fabrics, but always within earshot. The journalist, a woman named Camille, leaned forward with genuine interest. "People are calling this comeback bold and elegant. But it feels like more than that. What does Studio Sinclair represent to you?" Helen didn't hesitate. It's a reclamation, she said, of time, of identity, of voice. Camille jotted down notes. And your ex-husband's role in your journey? Helen's voice remained calm. He was part of the silence that shaped me, but he doesn't get to narrate my growth. A beat. Camille lowered her pen slightly. That's a powerful statement. It's not about bitterness, Helen said. It's about truth. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just here, fully. The interview wrapped, and Camille left with gratitude and a promise to feature the story front page in the Sunday edition. When the door closed behind her, Lorraine raised an eyebrow. That, she said, was a masterclass. Helen smiled, not wide, not performative, just real. But as she walked back to the sketch table, her phone vibrated. A text from Paige. I think you should see this. Attached, a photo. Edward, sitting at a dinner table across from a columnist from the Tribune, with Helen's name circled in the headline, Mock-up, the muse behind the man, Edward Carrington's reinvention story. Her stomach dropped. But she didn't panic, because the studio wasn't just a dream anymore. It was brick, glass, thread, and light. Her story was already being written, by her own hand. Let Edward spin his tales. She had the truth, and soon the whole city would see it. Helen stared at the photo Paige had sent, her fingers tightening around the edges of her phone. The headline wasn't just misleading, it was infuriating. The muse behind the man. She let out a sharp breath, eyes narrowing. Edward wasn't just trying to rewrite history. He was using her to polish his own reflection. Again. Across the studio, Lorraine picked up on the shift in Helen's posture immediately. What happened? She asked, stepping forward, wiping her hands on a fabric scrap. Helen held out the phone. Lorraine took one look and groaned. Oh, he really doesn't learn, does he? Helen walked over to the windows, staring out at the late afternoon bustle of King Street. He's trying to spin this as his reinvention, that I was part of his story of growth. Lorraine scoffed. Honey, you didn't inspire him. You left him. And now he's trying to turn that into a marketing campaign. The truth stung deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just about image. It was the principle. For years, she'd been the quiet figure beside him, the elegant arm candy, the unacknowledged support system. And now, when she'd finally found her voice, he wanted to echo it as if it were his own. She felt the burn of that familiar old weight trying to settle back on her shoulders. But not this time. No more swallowing frustration. No more silence. We're going to respond, Helen said, turning back toward Lorraine. With what? A statement? No, she said, eyes sharpening. With a presence. We double down on the launch. We invite the right people. We tell the real story, loudly, elegantly, visibly. Lorraine grinned. Now that's the Helen Sinclair I missed. As they began mapping out ideas, Sam walked in, holding a rolled-up canvas and smelling faintly of sawdust and citrus. Got your signage for the front window, he announced, laying it carefully across the cutting table. Hand-painted, just like you wanted. Helen crossed to him and slowly unrolled it. It read, Studio Sinclair, created by a woman who refused to disappear. The room went still. Helen's throat tightened. You did this? Sam nodded. It's yours. The whole place is a reflection of who you are. She blinked quickly, but didn't look away. That headline Edward's pushing.
He's trying to make me part of his comeback story. Sam's eyes darkened. Because he knows you're the only part of it that people ever believed in. Helen didn't respond immediately, but she stepped closer, reached out, and laid her hand gently over his. Her voice dropped, low and honest. Thank you for letting me grow without rushing me. Sam squeezed her fingers. You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad I get to witness it. Lorraine, still within earshot, cleared her throat dramatically. This moment's adorable, but we've got about 70 RSVPs to update and a very high-stakes guest list to finalize. Helen smiled, grateful for the interruption. The next few days moved like lightning. Paige, surprisingly, offered to leak Edward's Tribune photo to a rival media outlet with the actual context. A man trying to reclaim his reputation through borrowed glory. Helen didn't ask how she managed it, but within 48 hours, the headline had been reframed. Now, readers saw Edward for what he was, an opportunist in the wake of his ex-wife's glow-up. It wasn't petty, it was justice. The buzz around Studio Sinclair's opening exploded. Women who'd followed Helen's designs from years ago started commenting on posts. Messages poured in. Stories of lost dreams, rekindled ambitions, support from strangers who now felt seen. Helen read every one, and when the last light was turned off the night before the opening, she stood in the center of her studio and simply breathed. No gowns, no crowd, no noise, just her. And that was enough. The next morning, the sun rose pink and gold over Charleston's harbor, casting a warm glow across the cobblestones as the city stirred to life. And somewhere on Calhoun Street, behind wide windows and open doors, Helen Sinclair prepared to walk into her future. No longer hidden, no longer muted, and no longer anyone's muse. She was the artist now, the headline, the name above the door. The air outside Studio Sinclair crackled with energy. Guests filed in slowly at first. Charleston creatives, former clients, friends of friends. But soon, the space swelled with bodies, laughter, and flashes of cell phone cameras. Music played soft jazz in the background, and champagne glasses clinked under the chandelier. Helen had chosen herself. It wasn't opulent. It was intentional. Every corner, every fabric swatch, every flower on the tables carried her fingerprint. Helen stood near the entrance in a deep sapphire gown of her own design, simple, elegant, and powerful. Her hair swept back in soft waves. She wasn't trying to look like someone's wife or someone's memory. She looked like a woman who had come home to herself. Lorraine drifted toward her, holding a glass. You realize people are here just to see you, right? The clothes are the bonus. Helen smiled. I'm still getting used to that. Well, soak it in, Lorraine said, sipping her champagne. You've earned this moment. A tap on Helen's shoulder made her turn. It was Paige. She looked beautiful, in a cream pantsuit, her hair slicked back, no jewelry, except one thin gold chain. Hi, she said, surprisingly soft. Hi, Helen replied, unsure what this version of Paige wanted. I just wanted to say, you did it, Paige said. And I'm sorry it took me this long to realize what a shadow you were living in. Helen searched her expression, waiting for the edge, but it didn't come. I used to think I was the winner, Paige continued. You were the perfect wife. I was the wild card. But watching you tonight, I think we were both stuck in the same lie. He made us both feel like we had to orbit him. You just stopped spinning sooner. Helen didn't speak for a moment. Then,
Thank you. That means more than you know. Paige nodded and glanced around. Well, it's beautiful, truly. And for what it's worth, I think he's miserable. I'm not, Helen said gently. Paige smiled, not with bitterness, but something close to relief. Good. Then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. Helen turned to find Sam standing at the edge of the main hall. He wasn't dressed like everyone else. No tie, sleeves still rolled, but he belonged in the room as surely as she did. He offered her a small nod. She crossed the floor slowly, weaving through guests, until they stood side by side, facing the collection. This is something else, he murmured. She leaned toward him. It's more than I dreamed. You know you stole the show. I didn't want to steal it, she said. I wanted to own it. Sam looked at her, his voice low and serious. You do? There was a pause, long enough to stir something deeper. I got asked to do a spotlight segment on WNCL, Helen said quietly. An in-depth interview. A woman's journey through reinvention. You'll be great. I want to include you. He blinked. Me? You've been part of this, she said, but only if you want to stand beside me in the light. Sam didn't answer right away. Then he took her hand, right there in the middle of the crowd, and said, I'm not here for your spotlight. I'm here because I believe in the woman behind it. The noise of the room seemed to fade, just a little. In the final hour of the night, Helen made her way to the small podium they'd placed near the back wall, flanked by a banner that read, Redefining Revival. She tapped the mic once, gently. Conversations died down. Eyes turned toward her. Thank you all, she began, her voice steady but warm. A year ago, I stood in a life that no longer fit. I was surrounded by things that looked beautiful on the outside but felt hollow inside. I thought, maybe I was too late, too old to start over, too tired to try again. She paused, breath-catching. But I was wrong, because reinvention isn't about age or perfection. It's about choice. It's about finally listening to the voice you buried under all the expectations and noise and asking, what do I want now? A few people nodded. Others stood motionless. This space, this studio, it's not just about fabric or fashion. It's about showing up for yourself, even when you're scared. It's about refusing to stay small. And if my story helps just one woman do that, then every step here was worth it. Applause built from the back, sweeping forward until it surrounded her. Helen didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for herself. She stepped away from the mic, back into the arms of the night, where her name was no longer whispered behind someone else's. It was spoken boldly, and it belonged entirely to her. The morning after the launch felt like the hush after a symphony, the echoes of applause still fresh, the air tender with possibility. Helen woke before sunrise, not from nerves, not from stress, from peace. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a long cream robe, and padded barefoot to the balcony that overlooked the quiet courtyard behind her apartment above the studio. The garden below was still shaded, the trees casting long fingers of shadow across the stones. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the silence hold her. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Caroline. Mom, everyone at school is talking about the article. I'm so proud of you. Helen smiled. There was something sacred in seeing your child witness your becoming. Not the polished version, but the process. Another buzz followed, this time from an unknown number. A single line. You made your point. She didn't need to guess. Edward. She didn't reply.
She deleted it without hesitation. Downstairs, the studio felt different. Like it had inhaled the energy of the night before and was now exhaling calm. The gowns were still displayed, but the lights were dimmed. She ran her fingers along the reception desk. Lorraine had joked it was her command post and smiled at the sticky note left behind. Queen things only. See you after my hair appointment. L. She moved into the back workspace, where fabric samples lay beside new sketches. She reached for a pencil, but stopped short when she noticed a small box on her drafting stool. Not wrapped, just placed. She opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate gold necklace, a single charm, a needle threading through a heart. There was no note, but the knock on the glass door told her who had left it. Sam stood outside, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Helen opened the door. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. "And it's not a gesture. It's just a truth I wanted you to wear." Her breath caught. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Like everything you do." He hesitated. "Helen, I need to ask you something, and I don't want the answer unless it's real." She met his eyes. There was no charm, no coyness, just the kind of stillness that meant something mattered. "Are you open to trying us without rushing, without labels, but real?" Helen's chest rose slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the box. "I've spent years being what someone else needed, and I promised myself I wouldn't fill that space just to avoid being alone." "I'm not asking you to fill anything," Sam said gently. "I'm asking if you want to build something, together." She looked down, then back up. "Yes," she said, voice shaking slightly. "Yes, I want to try." His smile didn't rush. It landed like sunrise, gradual and certain. She stepped forward into the warmth of it. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. That afternoon, Helen hosted a quiet press luncheon inside the studio, this time with women from small publications, bloggers, and design students from the local college. It wasn't about press coverage. It was about paying it forward. As she stood near the window, one of the students approached, a young woman with large glasses, nervous hands, and a spiral notebook clutched against her chest. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just wanted to tell you, your speech last night, about not being too old to start over. It meant a lot. My mom's been stuck in a job she hates for 20 years, and I sent her a video of what you said." She cried. Helen placed a hand gently on the girl's arm. "Tell her it's never too late. She just needs to believe her own story is worth writing." The girl nodded, eyes welling up. "Thank you." Later that evening, as the golden hour painted the walls in amber light, Helen returned to the upstairs apartment. She walked into the closet, pulled down a box from the top shelf, and opened it slowly. Inside were her wedding rings. She held them one last time, let the weight of memory pass through her, then placed them gently into a small velvet pouch and locked them away, not out of bitterness, but closure. She walked back to the balcony, slipped on the necklace Sam had given her, and sat with a fresh cup of tea. The world didn't feel loud anymore, just full of breath, of promise, and finally, of her. The Charleston morning shimmered with quiet elegance, mist rolling low along the cobblestones, magnolia trees swaying gently as the city exhaled the last of its summer heat. Helen stood barefoot in the doorway of her studio, sipping a cup of strong coffee, wrapped in an oversized sweater that used to belong to her father. She liked how the sleeves swallowed her hands. She liked that it made her feel anchored.
Inside, Studio Sinclair buzzed with gentle activity. Lorraine hummed as she arranged display pieces for the upcoming charity auction. Sam was in the back, quietly fixing a squeaky hinge on one of the gallery cabinets. They moved like a family. No titles, no labels, just rhythm and care. Helen turned back inside and laid her phone gently on the counter. She'd just gotten off a call with the Charleston Design Alliance. They'd invited her to serve as keynote speaker at next spring's Women in Design conference. She hadn't said yes. Not yet. Instead, she'd said, "Let me think about it." Because now, she understood the value of a pause, of making space before saying yes to anything, even good things. "Am I interrupting the calm?" Sam asked, stepping out from the back, wiping his hands with a cloth. Helen shook her head, smiling, just savoring it. He walked closer, then nodded toward her phone. "That the Design Alliance?" She nodded. "They want a keynote. And you're not sure?" "I am," she said, eyes steady. "I'm just not rushing into yes anymore." He smiled, proud. "You're different, you know. I feel different." They stood there in the hush between moments, and she reached out, brushing her fingers over his. There wasn't urgency in the touch, just truth. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the first time we met. I didn't see it then, but you were the first man in a long time who didn't try to fix me." Sam tilted his head. "You were never broken." Helen swallowed the lump in her throat. Let silence say what words couldn't. Then she whispered, "Stay a while?" "I'll stay as long as you let me," he said gently. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lorraine peeked out from the side. "We have a guest." A woman stepped inside, mid-60s, warm eyes, hesitant smile. She carried a folded paper in her hand. Helen stepped forward. "Hi, can I help you?" The woman held out the paper. It was the Post-Courier article, now weeks old. Helen's face, mid-laugh, captured beside a headline that read, "She refused to disappear. The rebirth of Helen Sinclair." "I hope this isn't strange," the woman said. "My daughter sent this to me. She's a student at the university. She told me, 'Mom, you need to meet this woman. She's doing what you've been too scared to do.'" Helen's breath caught. "I've been a seamstress all my life," the woman continued. "Alterations mostly, weddings, curtains, always for someone else. But lately, I've been wondering if I have one last dream in me." "You do," Helen said instantly, voice firm and soft at once. The woman's eyes glistened. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. Helen reached for her hand. "Start here." And just like that, Studio Sinclair became something more. Not just a boutique or a brand, but a haven. A place for women to remember who they were before the world told them who to be. The woman left with an open invitation to the studio's mentorship program. Lorraine had already taken her name, her number, and her favorite fabric to work with. Sam had started brewing more coffee. And Helen sat down at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote something at the top of a new page. "You are never too far gone to come back to yourself." That evening, when the studio closed, Helen climbed the stairs to her apartment and opened the small box she'd been keeping by her bedside. Inside, among old sketches and letters, was a note she'd written months ago and never read again. A letter to her future self. She unfolded it slowly. "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, I hope you finally chose you. I hope you let the silence teach you instead of haunt you. I hope you cried when you needed to, laughed more than you thought possible, and danced, even if no one was watching. I hope you looked in the mirror and saw more than survival. I hope you saw brilliance And if you haven't yet, that's okay. There's still time. Just don't forget, you were never too late. You were just on your way. Love, the woman you almost forgot. Helen folded the letter, pressed it to her heart, and exhaled. Downstairs, she could hear Sam moving in the kitchen, humming something soft. She smelled rosemary and lemon, and a little too much garlic. She smiled. She'd made it. Not to some mountaintop or miracle, but home. Inside herself. And that was everything. Thanks for watching Sky Millionaire, where kindness meets real life. At Sky Millionaire, we believe every act of generosity deserves to be shared. So stay tuned and keep spreading hope with Sky Millionaire.